Bryan moved to New York City with dreams as bright as the city lights, clutching a suitcase filled with his hopes and a letter from his late mother, reminding him to never stop believing in the impossible. He had spent months saving up, working long hours at a diner in his small hometown, convinced that his future lay in the bustling streets of Manhattan. When he first arrived, the energy of the city filled him with a sense of boundless possibility. The skyscrapers seemed to reach for the heavens, and the thrumming rhythm of life was intoxicating. He found a tiny studio apartment in the Bronx, barely more than a closet, but it was his, a symbol of the fresh start he so desperately craved. Yet, beneath his optimism lurked an unease, a gnawing doubt that perhaps he was out of his depth in this sprawling metropolis. The city's indifference became clear as Bryan began the grueling job hunt. Days turned into weeks, then months, with nothing but rejection emails or worse, no responses at all. His savings dwindled alarmingly fast, forcing him to choose between skipping meals or paying the rent. The nights were the hardest. Alone in his apartment, Bryan would sit by the window, watching the city lights blur through his tears. He kept his mother's letter on his bedside table, reading it over and over whenever despair threatened to consume him. "You're stronger than you think, my boy," she had written. But in those dark moments, he felt anything but strong. Loneliness became his constant companion, settling in like an unwelcome guest. He tried to make friends, striking up conversations with coworkers at his part-time barista job, but everyone seemed too busy, too preoccupied with their own struggles. His only connection to home was his weekly phone call with Emma, his younger sister. She would tell him about the family dog, the changing seasons in their hometown, and her college classes. "You're doing your best, Bryan," she always said, her voice filled with a hope he couldn't feel for himself. Her calls were a lifeline, but they also highlighted the chasm between his reality and the life he had envisioned. Slowly, he began to withdraw, his world shrinking to the confines of his tiny apartment and the relentless cycle of work and rejection. One chilly November evening, while waiting for the subway, Bryan heard the haunting strains of a violin echoing through the station. An old man stood at the platform's edge, playing a melody that seemed to pierce through Bryan's sorrow. The music stirred memories of his mother's lullabies, of simpler times when life's problems could be soothed away with her gentle voice. Compelled, Bryan approached the man and emptied the last of his change into the violin case. "It's not much," he said, his voice trembling. The man looked up, his weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "It's enough," he replied. For the first time in months, Bryan felt a flicker of connection, as though someone finally understood the weight he carried. As winter set in, Bryan's struggles reached a breaking point. Unable to pay his rent, he was evicted from his apartment. The streets of New York became his new home, a cold and unyielding place where every day was a battle for survival. Yet, even in his darkest hours, Bryan found solace in writing. He carried a battered journal, filling its pages with stories drawn from his pain and longing. Writing became his refuge, a way to process the overwhelming despair that threatened to engulf him. One evening, huddled in a shelter, Bryan poured his soul into a story about a young boy who built a kite to escape a storm. He didn't know it then, but that story would change his life. Months later, Emma surprised him with a visit. She found him thinner and more worn than she'd ever seen him, but his eyes still held a spark of determination. She begged him to return home, but Bryan refused, his pride and his belief in his dreams keeping him anchored in the city. "I'm not done here," he said, his voice firm despite the tears streaming down his face. Emma hugged him tightly, leaving him with a small envelope of cash and a promise to always be there for him. Bolstered by her visit, Bryan mustered the courage to submit one of his stories to a small literary magazine. To his astonishment, they published it, praising its poignant reflection of the human spirit. Spring arrived with a whisper of hope. Bryan's story gained traction, catching the attention of a local publisher. He was offered a modest book deal, a chance to compile his writings into a collection. As he held the contract in his hands, standing in the middle of a crowded street, he felt a wave of emotion he couldn't quite describe. The city that had nearly broken him had also become the crucible where his resilience was forged. His journey was far from over, but for the first time in a long while, Bryan allowed himself to believe in the impossible. With his mother's letter in his pocket and a new story waiting to be written, he stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever came next.